Hi friends, welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into some of the ancient world's wackiest facts. I'm Marc Graves, and today we're going to be dipping our toes into the ongoing debate of was cannabis used in the ancient world, and if so, how and how much? This is a topic that I've been interested in for a while, but have been kind of intimidated to tackle, partly because it's not something I know tons about. I've never encountered it in a class or a seminar. It's just not something that comes up very often. And the other thing I was worried about is that everybody who writes about this topic is going to be in one of two camps. Either they're going to think that cannabis is stupid, the ancient Greeks never used cannabis, and anyone who researches cannabis is an idiot. And on the other hand, everyone else is going to think that cannabis is amazing, the Greeks were using cannabis all the time, and any story or theory that we have ever heard about cannabis use is just automatically true. So I don't trust either of those people, so I tried to read a little bit of both and hopefully find a happy middle. But I mean, new information is coming out all the time, and like I said, I'm by no means an expert on this topic, so definitely look into yourself and don't consider this video like the definitive word on this question. But the resources that I used are: one, Cannabis in the Ancient Roman World by Alan Sumler. Great book, and definitely on the pro-cannabis side. And then I also found an article, Marijuana in Ancient Greece and Rome, the Literary Evidence by Theodore F. Brunner, and he's on the no cannabis side. So check those out and let's get into a discussion of what they say. So there isn't a debate over whether ancient Greeks and Romans would have had access to cannabis, because hemp was grown all over the place. It was produced commercially for use in things like ropes and textiles, and also sometimes in medicine. So in some medical texts, cannabis will be mentioned as an ingredient, but it's not used, as far as we can tell, ever for its psychoactive properties, altering consciousness, anything like that. It's usually used for things like earaches, so not necessarily what you would want to see. It's not as exciting, at least. And it doesn't really come up in the literature, and that is the main thrust of Theodore's argument, because he says, look, wine is mentioned like countless times. It's all over the place. Wine consumption, wine manufacture. There's a whole dedicated god to wine. So the Greeks have no problem talking about that drug, and if they were using cannabis on anywhere near that level, we would expect way more references to it, but there's only like a handful of references to cannabis at all. So his argument is that, therefore, based on what the Greeks and Romans themselves say, it seems like they were almost never using cannabis recreationally. There are a couple exceptions to this. For instance, the Greek historian Herodotus mentions cannabis being used recreationally or for those psychoactive properties, but it's not in reference to the Greeks. Actually, it's in reference to some different groups of foreigners, and those are some interesting passages, so let's take a look at least one of them. This passage is in reference to an unnamed group of people who live on islands on the river Araxes. So it says, "They know, it is said, of trees which have a fruit, whereof this is the effect. Assembling in companies and kindling a fire, the people sit around it and throw the fruit into the flames. Then the smell of it as it burns make them drunk as the Greeks are with wine, and more drunk as more fruit is thrown on the fire, till at last they rise up to dance and even sing." And then, to get into Alan's argument, he points out that the word in that passage of Herodotus for being intoxicated is methiskontai, which basically just means drunk, and that if you look, the Greeks don't actually have a separate word for being high or for being intoxicated. They all are just being drunk. And so he argues that the Greeks could easily be talking about consuming cannabis or other drugs, about being high or being intoxicated, and we just don't know it because it looks to us, if you're not paying attention, like they're just drinking. He also points out to some new archaeological evidence. People have gone and looked at like wine vessels and wine cups and found that if you like examine the dregs of those, put those under the microscope, that there's all kinds of chemicals in wine besides just wine. And sometimes it's just dyes or things to change the flavor, but sometimes they found a whole other drugs that have been added as well. So things like opium and hellebore and cannabis. So you could easily make the argument that the Greeks were consuming cannabis, just not on its own. They were consuming it in and with wine, and that they didn't distinguish between it and wine really, that it was all just kind of one thing, just one being intoxicated. And there is actually some literary evidence that this is the case as well. So if you look at Galen's De Alimentorum Facultatibus, he actually has a passage that indicates basically this. So he says, there are some who fry and consume the seed together with other desserts. I call desserts those foods which are consumed after dinner in order to stimulate an appetite for drinking. The seed creates a feeling of warmth and, if consumed in large amounts, affects the head by sending to it a warm and toxic vapor. And Pliny, a Roman historian, has a similar passage that goes, there is a laughing weed in Bactria and along the Borsithines River. If this plant is consumed with myrrh and wine, different hallucinations are observed, and there is no end of laughing until you drink the kernel of pine nuts with pepper and honey in palm wine. So after looking at both of those passages as well as a few others, I think it is pretty reasonable to think that the Greeks and Romans probably did consume cannabis fairly regularly. They just didn't like to have it by itself, and they didn't smoke it. They preferred to have it in other food and drink. So seems reasonable, but I don't agree with Ellen on everything. There was actually one passage that made me burst out laughing while I was reading it. So he said at one point that the inclusion of cannabis in so many late medical texts is proof that the ingredient was commonly available and always effective. Pharmacy was built on observed outcome after all, so cannabis passed the curative test. So I find this kind of hilarious because on the one hand, I mean, there is some truth to it that doctors and just people who dealt with medicine in the ancient world did observe what worked and tried to repeat that, but that was by no means completely effective. If you followed my channel at all, you know that there are all kinds of bizarre, strange, wacky cures that the Greeks and Romans used on a regular basis for centuries that, as far as we know now with modern science, have nothing to do with curing people. So I just find that kind of funny and weird that he's saying that because cannabis shows up so often in the medical text that it was obviously effective. That just doesn't really make sense to me. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I hope that you found it as interesting and as fun as I did. Special thank you, as always, to subscribers and to Patreon members. And this month's Patreon bonus video, I should say, is going to be a little goofy, but hopefully fun. I'm asking all the members to submit, like, what is their favorite ancient philosophy, or if you could fuck, marry, kill anyone in the ancient world, who would you pick? So I'm gonna be reading everybody's responses and then giving my own thoughts. So if you want in on that, definitely check that out and get your answers in soon. And yeah, thank you everyone, and I hope to see all of you again next week. Karate.